This is the Nielsen Norman Group UX podcast. I'm Therese Fessenden. Today we're going to cover a central tenet of digital design. As a user experience professional, it's often startling how often the conversation focuses on the experience part of that label as opposed to the user part. Design is a wonderfully creative endeavor, but at its best, it's the result of far more than just good guesswork.
I think the heart of my work is that research and observation that's a key factor in kind of everything.
I got the chance to chat with Alita Joyce, a fellow UX specialist at NNG.
And so if I'm speaking, it's based on research. If I'm working with a client, I'm probably doing some research. If I'm writing, it's based on research findings.
And we talked about the pitfalls of relying on assumptions or intuition a little too much instead of using data when making design decisions. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. Without further ado, here's Alita. So just to give our listeners a little bit of background about you, you are a UX specialist. And, obviously as a user experience professional, we care about the user experience. We care what users might need. And I think after a while, like with reading and, really diving into some of the literature and academic papers, you kind of start to anticipate what users might need. And I think to a certain extent, some of that can be useful, and I highly encourage, reading and educating yourself on stuff. But I also wonder, are we missing out on something when we kind of lean a little too heavily on some of these pieces of literature, some of these papers, and some of these articles? What do you think of this? Where do you think the limit is in anticipating what people need?
Yeah, I think that's a really thoughtful question. I mean, I got into this work from a coding boot camp, actual, full stack development, which during that I found I was doing a lot of testing with my own work, and my instructor was kind of like, maybe you should look into UX. You're a great developer, but it seems like this is where your interest might be leading you. And that brought me to grad school at Northwestern, which was a fantastic program. And they really teach you a lot about all of these guidelines and heuristics and ways to anticipate design. Of course, some research, but not quite as much, hands-on research that you get when you're in practice. And so I think you're so right that, as people get deeper into their career in UX, you learn a lot about your users and you start to make these connections and similarities that you see between different users and different products. And you start to apply some of the things that you know about psychology and human behavior. But what's so important there is, like you said, not just to rely on kind of what you know or what you think you know and anticipating those behaviors, but actually testing those assumptions. I think that that's kind of the strategy that I take in a lot of different areas of, having a great understanding of psychology and human behavior. But when it comes to products that I've been working on for years and years, or even new products, documenting those assumptions, how do I think users are going to act? And then testing it, trying to get those insights, testing my assumptions. And what I found is that users always surprise me. So I think absolutely having that foundational understanding and being able to anticipate some of those user behaviors will definitely save you time and make you more efficient at testing potentially good solutions. But nothing substitutes research for ensuring good behavioral design.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I know that you instruct, the human mind and usability, very popular class, and I loved that class. And I also teach the persuasive and emotional design class. So very much in line with what you're saying, which is that, yes, there are some things, some principles that we can sort of use as a starting point, as a foundation for maybe the hypotheses that we have about our eventual research. But yes, man, users are surprising. There was this hilarious video I saw actually recently, and it was, one of those kids play sets where you have these different shapes and you put the little different shaped blocks into different shaped holes. So you have the square block, right? So the square block is supposed to go in the square hole. And it's just this hilarious video of this person watching somebody else put different blocks into the different shaped
Mhm.
holes. And so this person would say, okay, square block, this goes into the square hole. And then the next one is like the rectangle block. This one goes into the square hole. And then the next one is like, okay, those seem pretty fair. Now, what about the circle one? This observer woman is like, oh, it's going in the circle hole. And the person was like, guess where this goes? The square
Yes.
hole. It's just hilarious. So if you happen to catch that video, it's been circulating the UX community, but it is
Yeah,
absolutely
I saw
true.
that on TikTok.
Yeah, you did?
Absolutely. Yeah, great one to include in show notes. It is such a great example of that idea that, we'll assume people would do the same thing as us. And, there are definitely people that are thinking it has to go in the appropriate, slot, square to square, circle to circle. And in reality, you'll see people do things in very different ways and continues to surprise you, even with products that you've been working on for years and years. And with a target audience that you know and you're familiar with, man, they will just continuously surprise you, their approaches to solving problems.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it makes me wonder sometimes, like, there are some incredible workarounds that sometimes get developed. Now, I wanted to pick your brain because there is a common mantra in the UX community, but particularly at our UX conferences, and that is you are not the user. And I think this is an important concept. It's one of those things that's either extremely straightforward and you get it right away, or you kind of disagree with it because you're like, but I am a
Yeah.
user. So I want to get your thoughts about this particular statement. Like, what do you think of it?
I personally love this. This is one of my favorite UX mantras, and I will totally defend it. It's one of a soapbox that I'll die on for sure. That you are not the user, and I think when we're thinking about this mantra or this slogan, whatever you want to call it, I think of it more as like a guiding principle. And I think when people talk about you are not the user, a lot of times that sentiment is coming from, oh, we need to empathize with our users and things like that, which is true. Absolutely. Empathy is at the heart of what we do. But as you're explaining that to stakeholders, sometimes stakeholders will hear empathy and say, oh, that's soft. We don't need to go down that soft, touchy feely path of connecting with our users. And so another way that I'll kind of think about you are not the user is in terms of this psychology study that backs up this exact concept, and it's called the false consensus effect, which is basically a tendency to assume that others are going to share the same beliefs as us or act as we would in a particular context, which you can kind of see where that's going with our interfaces. We'll assume people will act like us. So, the research study that kind of came to this conclusion was done by two researchers, Ross and Green, in the 1970s. And what would happen is they would bring participants in and give them a scenario to place themselves in. And at the end of walking them through the scenario, they had two decision points to make. So, I want to walk you through one. It's my favorite. It's kind of this grocery shopping example, since that tends to be quite relatable. So let's say, Therese, you're leaving a grocery store and a man in a nicely dressed suit comes up to you and he says, Therese, I'd love to hear, how do you like shopping at the grocery store? And you respond, you like shopping at the store. You think they have reasonable prices and a good selection of meats and produce. And so the man says, great, my film crew, surprise, surprise, was actually here recording this whole thing. And we'd love to know if you would sign a release to be in a new upcoming commercial for the grocery store. Now, with that scenario in mind, as the research participant, there are two questions that you need to ask, and they're in a very particular order. So, Therese, I'll ask you, what percentage of your peers do you think would sign the release to be in this commercial?
Probably like 60 to 75%. That would be if I was super optimistic, but I have a feeling this is setting me up for a big reveal.
Yes. So now let me ask, would you yourself sign the release to be in the commercial?
Probably if I really liked that store. Like I could see it. I mean, I do run a podcast, so I could be kind of biased in my position to be in the
Sure.
spotlight, but yeah, I think if I genuinely liked that grocery store, like I could see myself doing that.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that, kind of similar to your responses, the researchers found that when participants completed this scenario, If people said the general population was likely to do either sign the release or to not sign the release, they also themselves stated, they were likely to sign the release or not. So in your
Mhm.
case, yes, you rated it likely that, the general population would sign the release. And as you said, yes, you are a public figure, of course. And so you yourself would also sign the release. I'm in the same boat, though I've done this thought experiment with many of my friends who are more engineering side and less favorable of being a public figure. And they always say, nope, not interested in being in a commercial, like no YouTube, no podcasting for me. And they're saying they also wouldn't sign it. And this is just such an interesting manifestation, again, of this principle that we tend to assume others are like us. And so we'll make judgments in the same way. And so it's so important to just realize that this effect exists. And again, that study is really showing us this basis for you are not the user in a more scientific way. We can link to that full study in the show notes. I think it's a really interesting one. They have a couple of different scenarios, but this is why we want to put so much effort into observing users, not just trusting kind of what we anticipate users to do or what a specific guideline says, because our designs are very contextual. Our users change, their behaviors change, and we want to make sure that we're testing those assumptions, not just relying on this book says this or this guideline says this, but actually seeing how real users interact with those products in context.
On that topic, right, of being able to read and kind of have a good sense of these guidelines and principles and using that, but not necessarily over relying on it. I think the word that comes to mind for me is like a heuristic evaluation, right?
Hmm.
So it's like,
Yes.
oh, we can evaluate a design based on some common usability heuristics and see how well or not well it can meet some universal user needs. So I do think those can be useful, but I
Hmm.
wanted to get your thoughts. Like, do you think this is maybe useful in certain contexts more than other contexts? Like, is there a point when we should like prioritize research over some of these kind of quicker shortcut ways?
I think that, I mean, heuristic evaluations are great. They allow you to like it says, implies evaluate an interface based on heuristics that have been determined and tend to apply in the majority of cases. This is Jacob Nielsen's 10 usability heuristics, which was specific at the time to more web applications. I applied those same principles to video games in one of my articles and found it to be the same. Later this year, I'm going to apply those principles to VR. And they are a fantastic way to just evaluate and see how a system might be meeting some of those kind of core aspects of our design. But only behavioral research and observational research is going to ensure good behavioral design. And I'll give you kind of an example with a friend that lives in Seattle and works for a large enterprise ecosystem. And one of the things that I found in talking with him about some of his work is that the users of the system and the designers of the system, they kind of work together. They're both using the systems, but one on the designer side is they are the designers of the system. They know a lot more about the system than a regular user in an office somewhere. But they're relying arguably a little too heavily on those heuristic evaluations on what they know about the system and how they're using it. And that can manifest itself in a lot of different ways that, can be somewhat detrimental to regular users that aren't designing the system. And the point is that the designers and developers and stakeholders that design these systems are very different, oftentimes very different than the real people that use those products. And so I think it's so important to kind of balance out your own type of heuristic evaluations as well as that behavioral research. And thinking about the heuristic evaluations and relying on some of these guiding principles, I think that it can save us a lot of time in those early phases of design or when you're first evaluating a design and help you target areas to go in and focus on more behavioral research. So I definitely see them working in tandem. They both have benefits, but at the end of the day, I think that only behavioral research can ensure that good, usable behavioral design.
I often find that when we're still learning about a situation or learning about a user and like we're in those early discovery stages, I think conducting research is so important, actual like observational research, because it's amazing how much we can assume that a design is mostly good because it meets these heuristics according to our understanding. If we were users, it seems to meet our expectations. And you're right, like as design, and when I say designers, I'm referring to anyone who is involved in the process of
Hmm.
creating some sort of design, whether that's development and research. We know too much. Like
Yes.
we see how the sausage gets made, so to speak. So
Hmm.
we have a very different perspective than the people who don't see this or who don't have that context or don't even have the vocabulary
Yeah.
to say the things that we're saying. So 100% agree that, there's really no substitute. I think there's a way you can be efficient and maybe
Hmm.
prioritize your efforts and maybe focus your research where you know the least about your
Right.
users. But that
Yeah.
means you have to know something about your users before you can
Hmm.
really start taking some of these. I don't even want to call it a shortcut, but for lack of a better term,
Yeah,
shortcuts.
yeah, absolutely. And it can be great because it will save you time, but again, you just have to go out and watch people using these products because they continuously surprise us and their own, our own users are not trying to waste a lot of time. They have their own shortcuts in our products and in their own workflows. And those can be so beneficial to uncover and research and help us adapt our designs to better support some of those needs for efficiency.
Yeah, for sure. So this makes me think of another hot topic.
Hmm.
Hot take. Should we then have users design products if we know that we might be biased? Like there's always this risk, right? That
Yeah.
if we're making all these decisions, that we're going to be biased in all those decisions. No, and I think to some extent we can combat some of those biases by being aware of them. But I also wonder, perhaps maybe there's a benefit to involving the very people who are going to use this. So, what do you think of that? I know there's always risks to
Yeah.
this, but I also think there's a huge benefit to this. So, I want your thoughts.
This, I think, is such an interesting space. Definitely something that Don Norman has been publishing more about. I think he just had a video with us about kind of community design and this changing role of researchers. I also read Democratizing Innovation by Eric von Hippel. It's an MIT press book and kind of looks at that same thought of, okay, we are the designers, we're including users in our process, but they still know more about their experience than we do because they're living their experience. So we're the designers, but should they just be kind of coming up with their own solutions? I think that it can depend on the process. I think that my take on it is just involving users in the process through your discovery into testing actual design solutions and into evaluating your design. Once it's live and out there, how are users working with it? So I'm a huge fan in involving participants throughout the process. I know, Therese, you and I both teach journey mapping and service blueprinting and design thinking, so we are no strangers to including users in our process. And it's such a valuable tool to just see how they tackle or anticipate they would tackle some of those problems. So yeah, I'm a huge proponent for including users in the process in a lot of different ways. And yeah, letting them experiment with, how might you solve this problem? What could this product do for you to help you better reach your goals, and listening to what feedback they have. I just wrapped up the social media research not too long ago and was
Woo!
analyzing. Yes, so exciting. One of the questions that I ask people is, what advice would you give to companies designing posts for, the type of user that you are on social media? And some of that advice was great and aligned with my other research findings. And other advice was maybe a little bit more emotionally targeted, a little more personal. And I think that working with users can be like that, is they'll highlight, verbally say things that you might have already uncovered in your own behavioral analysis. And other times they might say things and you evaluate it from a product standpoint and find, I get the sentiment, but we couldn't apply it in that specific way. So taking their, what users say with a grain of salt and really combining that with observational research to get a holistic view, I think is so, so important.
Yeah, on the one hand, design by committee is a dangerous prospect because
Yeah.
it can often mean we hodgepodge together something that hasn't actually been analyzed and thought through. And it's really just the squeaky wheels, right, that get the oil,
Uh-huh.
or the squeaky wheels who contribute to the design. So I do think there is a responsibility for designers to help moderate that process and facilitate that.
Hmm.
So yes, I think we definitely should take what users, there's always that saying that users will say one thing and do another. Again,
Yes.
why I'm always a huge proponent of observational research in addition to some of these other self-reported types of research like
Hmm.
surveys and such. But yeah, I would say that's our job as designers, is to help analyze some of this. So just to kind of summarize or kind of hit one of the main points, it's that you know design is only going to go as far as the accuracy of the data that you put
Hmm.
into that. And as you said, to your point, people who are experiencing this in their day-to-day life are going to have a much more intimate and accurate understanding of that particular experience, even if we do try to empathize with our strongest willpower, or like
Yeah.
if we try really hard to empathize, we still might miss the mark a little bit. And I don't think we should beat ourselves up for that. I think we should still, strive to be as empathetic as possible.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's really important to empower some of those folks to help them make decisions. And if that means educating them, if that means or having them educate us, making it a co-creative process, I think is so essential.
Yeah. And one thing that you said there that kind of stood out to me is thinking about when we are analyzing not just our own strategies for research and also collecting data from other people, is those biases on both sides. Do you have any thoughts about some of the biases that exist both from the researcher side as you're planning the study or the user side when analyzing the data?
Gosh, yes. I'm laughing because I am also susceptible to this, right? Where I might
Hmm.
start a study and then I don't want to say an agenda, but I might have, oh, I have this hypothesis and I'm pretty strongly tied to this hypothesis, thinking, oh, yeah, this is definitely going to be the truth, but I'll test it anyway. And that's part
Hmm.
of the issue, is if we go into our studies with this like mission to prove something or validate something, as opposed to having a more open mind, it might actually taint our ability to like be objective about what findings
Hmm.
come in. So I have a lot of strong feelings about it because, and even then, even when I have strong feelings about it, it's not enough to combat some of the researcher bias that inevitably happens. But one way we can combat it, other than being aware of it, is having multiple researchers, and not just multiple researchers, but researchers from different backgrounds who
Hmm.
come from different places, have different upbringings, different life experiences, and with that, different worldviews. And I think that's a really important aspect into ensuring that your research actually is objective and that you are identifying as close to the real truth as possible. So that's
Yeah.
my little soapbox pitch. But what do you think, Alita? Do you think that, researcher bias can be combated, or is it something we're subject to dealing with forever?
This honestly, this exact thought, I don't want to say has plagued me, but has been so salient to me throughout my entire career. So, as you know, but listeners might not, I was a philosophy undergrad. So, being meta is, I feel like, part of my personality at this point. And so, with that, yeah, absolutely. Being aware of these human biases that exist is one thing, but then it's like, okay, well, I'm aware of these biases. So, does that mean I'm not susceptible anymore because I'm just so meta about my everyday life decisions? And of course, that's not the case. That's kind of where Daniel Kahneman has his system one and system two thinking.
Mhm.
Our fast automatic thoughts is system one, and then system two is those more thoughtful, being conscious of some of those actions. One researcher that I really love in this space is Adam Grant, and he's a organizational psychologist at University of Pennsylvania, with the Wharton School of Business. And he shared this idea of the I'm not biased bias, which is this exact thought, right? Of, recognizing these flaws in other people's thinking and observing biases in their worlds can force you to think, oh, I'm so aware of these biases in other people that I must be immune to them. And that's really not the case. And I think it's so important that we internalize this idea that the less biased you think you are, you're less likely to catch yourself. And, one thing that Adam Grant says on this topic that I really like is he says, if knowledge is power, then knowing what you don't know is wisdom. And I think that quote is so central to ideas that I have as a researcher is starting off every research project. What do I want to know? And continuously checking in with myself throughout of, okay, I now know information in this space. Now, what do I not know? And this kind of same concept applies to research. And I think the work that we do of thinking about one person, one expert, if you will, in UX is great, but let's try and understand what the community knows and contribute that wisdom and identify our knowledge gaps.
For sure. I think that's an inspiring note to think about. And not to mention, when you have something like a pandemic that throws a wrench into everything,
Right?
everything you think you know, not everything, but a lot of what
door.
you think you know goes right out the window. Yeah. So definitely stay curious and, see every change and every little update as an opportunity to learn more. And another thing too, I would love for our more senior or seasoned folks to do is think about growing this field too. I think the more eyes and ears we have looking at, user behavior, the more we learn as a whole. And I'm a huge fan of stewarding this profession. So if you happen to know of a junior employee or someone who isn't quite a junior employee yet, maybe even a student, giving those folks an opportunity to learn a little bit more and participate in some of that work, I think is a huge benefit to helping us all keep track of, our own biases and learning as much as we can. This was great, Alita. It has been already a half hour. Hard to believe that it is already time to wrap up. But if anyone wants to follow you and your work, where could you point people to? Any channels, any handles?
I am actually very active on Clubhouse. So for people on Clubhouse, my username is Alita UX. You can also catch me on Twitter. I post there as well as LinkedIn. You can just search for me by my full name, Alita Joyce. And yes, sharing lots of articles, research, quite a lot of stuff related to behavioral science and human behavior, in addition to just recent research findings.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time. It has been so much fun. I love getting real meta, and I'm so glad that I was able to do that with you. So I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Therese.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the NNG UX podcast. To learn more about some of the resources, reports, or courses cited in this episode, check out the episode notes for more details. Also, we have a weekly email newsletter where you can get updates about our latest research and info on upcoming UX certification events. To learn more, go to nngroup.com. That's nngroup.com. Finally, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts and like this show and you want to support our work, please leave a rating, and no matter what platform you choose, please hit subscribe. Thanks so much for your support. Until next time, and remember, keep it simple.